The phone vibrated for the 10th time in less than 3 minutes, but Henry Carter didn't even blink. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass pane that spanned the entire length of the 32nd floor of the Carter Tower, in the financial heart of Wall Street, New York City. His arms were crossed over his Italian-tailored grey suit, his eyes fixed on the thick fog blanketing the city below. From that height, New York looked like a chaotic, living organism, a mass of concrete and metal that never slept, never stopped, and Henry had always identified deeply with it. Neither of them had any patience for sentimentality. Fiona, his executive assistant of 7 years, broke the silence with the precision of someone who had learned exactly how to modulate her tone to avoid being ignored. "Mr. Carter, you have the teleconference with the Dubai investors in 48 minutes. I need to confirm your attendance." "Confirmed," he replied without turning around. She took 2 more steps closer, holding a tablet with the day's schedule and a thermal coffee mug she knew was the only thing Henry would accept at that moment. She had learned to read her boss's silent language better than anyone else in the office. At that instant, the language said, "Do not bother me with anything that isn't worth 8 figures. "There's one more thing," she said carefully. "It's about the visit to your parents. You had scheduled it for today, remember? It's been exactly 8 months since the last time, and Chloe from the clinic called yesterday asking if you received the medical report sent last month." Henry finally turned. There was an expression on his face that Fiona knew well. It wasn't anger nor pure indifference. It was something more complex, a veiled discomfort that he compressed inward with the same dexterity he used to close difficult deals. He was a man who had trained himself not to feel what wasn't convenient to feel. "I received the reports," he said. "Did you read them?" A minimal pause, long enough. "Have someone buy something for them, a gift, something expensive. Don't ask me to choose. You know what they like better than I do." Fiona didn't respond immediately. There was a millimeter of hesitation on her face, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Henry was a man trained to detect vacillation. It was what made him lethal in negotiations. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "No, sir, but you said last month that you were going to go in person this time." "And I am," he replied, taking the coffee mug from her hands. "After the teleconference, I'll stop by, drop off the gift, and be back for the 6 p.m. meeting with Roger. Calculate how much time I have." Fiona opened her tablet and began typing rapidly, as she always did when she needed to solve the impossible within ridiculous windows of time. That was what Henry paid her very well for, not for her opinion, for execution. "If you leave here by 2 p.m. at the latest, considering the midday traffic on the FDR Drive and the route to Scarsdale, you'll have about 40 minutes there, maybe 50 if there's no accident on the Hutchinson River Parkway." "Perfect. 40 minutes is more than enough. Buy the gift by then." She made a note, nodded and left. Henry turned his eyes back to the city. 40 minutes. That was all he could set aside for his own parents after 8 months of absence. And the part that disturbed him, the part he would never admit out loud, was that 40 minutes seemed perfectly reasonable within the logic of the life he had built for himself. Anthony and Nancy Carter had lived in the same Scarsdale mansion since Henry was 6 years old. A house too large for 2 elderly people, with a garden, a swimming pool, and a structure that required constant maintenance. After Henry started making real money, he began paying for everything without complaint. The landscaping crew, appliances replaced every 2 years, private doctors, the premium health plan. And then there was the housekeeper, the young woman who lived in the maids' quarters and took care of the couple's daily life. Henry barely knew her name. It had been Fiona who conducted the interviews, checked the documents, and settled the salary. He had merely signed the check. His father was 74, and his mother 71. In the few visits over the last 2 years, Henry had noticed them getting slower, whiter, more dependent on chairs and handrails than before. This bothered him, not in the tender way of someone who feels time passing alongside a loved one, but in the pragmatic way of someone who notices an asset beginning to require more maintenance than before. It was a horrible way to think about one's own parents, and somewhere deep inside Henry, there was a man who knew that. But that man had been buried under contracts, mergers, international trips, and cold boardrooms lit by artificial light. The teleconference with Dubai lasted 56 minutes. Henry closed 2 deals and left 3 others pending for the following week. When he turned off the camera, Fiona was already at the door with his coat, car keys, and a gift bag wrapped with care, complete with a gold ribbon bow. "What is it?" he asked, taking his coat. "A case of vintage French Bordeaux, 12 bottles. Your father mentioned once that he appreciates a good Saint-Emilion. I made a note of it at the time." "Good." Henry took the bag without looking at her. "Call Roger and tell him I might be 10 minutes late for the 6 p.m. meeting." "I already told him." He walked to the private elevator without another word. In the elevator mirror, as he descended the 32 floors, he looked at his reflection for a long moment. His suit was impeccable. His hair, cut the week before by a barber who only saw executives, was perfect. His tie, a shade darker than his suit, was a Windsor knot tightened with mathematical precision. He was the image of a man who had everything under control. In the basement, his driver, Charles, was waiting beside the armored SUV. Henry opened his own door before Charles could, threw the gift bag onto the back seat, and got in. Charles entered silently and waited. "Scarsdale," Henry said. "My parents' house." "Yes, sir." As the car cut through the early afternoon traffic with the help of GPS and Charles's knowledge of the city's shortcuts, Henry stared out the tinted window. New York passed by like a fast-forwarded movie. Traffic jams, weaving motorcycles, hurried pedestrians, street carts, giant billboards, construction projects that never ended. It was a city that collected a toll in the form of human energy, and Henry had paid that toll gladly for 20 years. His cell phone rang 3 times during the trip. He answered all 3. They were work calls. The gift bag sat on the seat beside him the entire way, untouched, its gold bow perfectly preserved, bought by someone else, chosen by someone else, wrapped by someone else. A gift with no part of him in it, except for the money that made it possible. When the car turned the familiar corner and the wrought iron gates of the mansion appeared at the end of the tree-lined street, Henry felt something he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't exactly nostalgia. It was more like the sensation of seeing an old photograph of someone you used to be but are no longer. A quick, brief pang that he shut away before it had time to expand into something more inconvenient. "You can wait here, Charles. I won't be long." He stepped out of the car with the bag in hand, adjusted his coat and walked down the path of manicured oaks to the main door. The house was quiet. The garden was well tended. There was a faint smell of wet earth and flowers he couldn't name. He stopped before the door and realized he hadn't rung the doorbell in he didn't know how long. This time, without warning, he pushed the handle. The door opened without resistance. And what Henry Carter found on the other side of that door was the beginning of the end of everything he believed to be true about himself and the world he had built. The entrance hall of the mansion smelled of the same scent as always, floor wax mixed with lavender, the smell of Henry Carter's childhood compressed into molecules that the New York air had preserved intact while he lived at 1,000 miles per hour in sterile apartments and luxury hotels around the world. It was a scent that slightly disoriented him, like any involuntary memory, not because it was bad, but because it caught him red-handed in his own humanity. And Henry had become a man who did not like being caught off guard. He walked slowly down the hallway, the gift bag in his right hand, his Italian leather shoes echoing on the old hardwood floor that his father had never allowed to be replaced with something more modern, even when Henry had insisted years ago that porcelain tile was easier to maintain. Anthony Carter was a man of firm convictions regarding the things he loved, and that floor was one of them. Henry had spent his whole life not understanding that kind of attachment. The hallway walls were lined with photographs. He didn't look at them. He knew they were there, the same old photos, him as a child, the 16th birthday party of a cousin he barely knew, his parents' trip to the Georgia coast in the 90s, the graduation portrait that Nancy had framed with excessive pride, and that Henry, at the time, had found tacky. Now, he preferred not to look. Photographs demanded feelings he didn't have time to process before his 6 p.m. meeting. He heard voices. They came from the living room at the end of the hall to the left. His father's voice, raspier than he remembered, more measured, like someone counting each syllable with the affection of one who knows that good stories deserve time. And another voice, feminine, young, with a light laugh that drifted up the hallway like soap bubbles. Then his mother's voice, more animated than he expected, with that gentle southern lilt that had never completely faded despite 40 years in New York. Henry slowed his pace without realizing it. There was something in that domestic, common sound that made him feel strange inside, as if he were about to enter a room where the rules were different from the rules of the world he knew. It was a sensation he couldn't name. Then he pushed open the living room door. The scene he found on the other side was etched into Henry Carter's memory with the precision of a flash photograph, every detail sharp, every color saturated by the intensity of the moment. The mansion's living room was spacious, with dark wood furniture dating back to the 90s, cream linen curtains on the high windows, and a central mahogany table that had always been the centerpiece of the room. It was on this table that Henry's eyes landed first. Stacks of cash. Dozens of them, piled with an organization that seemed almost deliberate, a meticulous order of bills forming a small mountain of paper currency on the polished wood surface. The amount was absurd. Even without counting, Henry Carter, who had spent his life reading numbers, instantly estimated there were tens of thousands of dollars there, perhaps much more. His father, Anthony, was sitting in his usual armchair by the left side of the window, a cup of coffee in his lap and a smile on his face that Henry hadn't seen in over a decade. Not the polite smile he used for guests, nor the tired smile his father wore when trying not to show worry. It was a genuine smile, the smile of someone who had just given something very important, who had participated in something that transcended the everyday. Nancy was in the other armchair, facing her husband, her hands clasped in her lap in a gesture that looked more like prayer than rest. His mother's face had a luminosity that shocked Henry. She looked 20 years younger. Her eyes shone with a vivid, warm emotion he didn't know she was still capable of. And beside Nancy, standing with one hand resting lightly on the elderly woman's shoulder, was the housekeeper. Henry would barely have recognized her if he'd passed her on the street. He knew her name started with T and that she was in her 20s, because Fiona had mentioned it when she hired her. Now, for the first time, he actually saw her. She was a young woman with olive skin, black hair tied in an improvised bun, a slightly wrinkled blue work apron, the hands of someone who had worked with her body her whole life, and large dark eyes that at that moment were looking at Nancy with an expression Henry, in those first fractions of a second, couldn't categorize. None of the three had noticed he was there yet. They were inside something, inside a world of their own that Henry had never visited, an intimacy built over days and weeks and months of shared daily life that he had outsourced with efficiency and indifference. His father said something Henry didn't catch, and the housekeeper laughed that soap bubble laugh, and Nancy closed her eyes for a second with an expression of absolute peace, her hand covering the housekeeper's hand on her shoulder. And then Henry Carter's brain did what it had always done when faced with data that didn't fit the models he understood. It began to construct an explanation, rapidly, with the surgical coldness of someone who had spent 20 years closing deals and identifying threats before they even took shape. The money on the table, the parents smiling with a joy he hadn't caused, the housekeeper at the center of it all, with the familiarity of someone who belonged in that space more than their own son, the safe in the master bedroom, the unrestricted access that girl had to the two seniors' routine, the isolation of the mansion, the vulnerability of two old people who trusted with the naivety of those who never suspected anyone. The verdict arrived in less than 5 seconds. Henry Carter dropped the gift bag on the floor, not noticing it tipped over and the gold ribbon crumpled against the hardwood floor his father loved so much. His jaw tightened with the rigidity of someone about to say something from which there is no turning back. The three in the room finally noticed his presence. His father opened his mouth first, the smile still on his face, his voice carrying that old joy Henry had forgotten the sound of. "Son, what a wonderful surprise, my boy." But Henry didn't look at his father. His eyes were fixed on the housekeeper, and on the housekeeper the soap bubble smile died before he even opened his mouth. Nancy was about to stand up to hug him when she noticed her son's expression. She stopped halfway, arms still open, her joy freezing on her face like water turning to ice in an instant. There was something in Henry's gaze she recognized with that specific maternal instinct, a reading that goes beyond words and reaches directly for intent. And what she read in that look made her sink back into the armchair with a weight that wasn't just her body. The housekeeper didn't yet know what was coming. She looked at the stranger in the doorway with the neutral expression of someone who had no reason to fear. She didn't. But Henry Carter, at that moment, had already formed his internal court and passed the sentence, and what followed would be merely the execution of a decision made with the wrong speed and the wrong certainty by a man who had spent his life being the smartest person in the room and had never learned that intelligence alone without humility is nothing but a knife pointed at oneself. He opened his mouth, and what he said changed the course of that afternoon forever. "Who are you?" Henry's voice cut through the air of the room like a badly tuned instrument striking a wrong note in a concert. It was too low for the gravity of the accusation it carried. Controlled, more dangerous precisely because of that. The housekeeper pulled her hand off Nancy's shoulder with a quick, instinctive movement, like someone pulling their fingers from a flame. There was something in her eyes. Not guilt, Henry would realize that later, much later, when there was no way to undo what he was about to do, but a genuine, almost childlike shock of someone who doesn't understand what is happening. "I'm Tamara," she said, her voice firm despite the startle. "I work here, sir." "I know you work here." Henry took 2 steps toward the table without taking his eyes off her. "What I want to know is what this is." He pointed to the stacks of cash with a sharp jerk of his chin. Nancy stood up from the armchair with an agility that surprised her son. "Henry, honey, let me explain." "Mum, sit down." The order came out automatically, without softness, in the tone he used to interrupt subordinates in meetings. Nancy stopped, her eyes blinking with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Anthony stood up as well, more slowly, bracing both hands on the arms of the chair. "Son, this money is ours. We took it from the bank this morning. Let your mother explain." "Dad, please." Henry raised one hand, palm open, a gesture that commanded his father to be silent before he could finish the sentence. It was the gesture of a man accustomed to being the only one speaking. "Let me understand what's going on here." He turned his eyes back to Tamara. She was standing in the same spot, her expression trying to remain calm, but her hands betrayed the tension, fingers interlaced in front of her apron, knuckles slightly whitened by the pressure. "Do you live here?" he asked, as if the answer were already an indictment. "I do, yes, sir. In the service room. Do you have access to the whole house?" "I do. I've worked here for almost a year. I take care of your father and mother." "You take care of them." He repeated her words with a different intonation, each syllable transformed into something sharp. "How much do you earn a month?" Tamara lifted her chin slightly, not out of arrogance, but with the instinctive dignity of someone raised not to bow their head in the face of humiliation. "You approve the deposits yourself, sir. You must answer the question." $2,300. Henry looked at the table, at the stacks. He looked back at her. "And you're going to explain to me how, on $2,300 a month, you have enough intimacy to convince 2 elderly people to withdraw this amount from the bank?" The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds that weighed like stone. "Henry." His father's voice was firm now, a firmness Henry rarely heard and which, when he did, always surprised him. "No one convinced anyone of anything. Your mother made the decision. I supported it. Tamara had nothing to do with the decision to go to the bank. Then why is the money here in the living room with her in the middle of it?" "Because we were waiting for her to arrive so we could give it to her," Nancy said, her voice carrying the tone Henry recognized as the sign that her patience was reaching its limit. "If you would stop acting like you're the sole owner of the truth for 1 second, I would explain everything to you." But Henry wasn't listening. The problem with a brain trained to build corporate narratives is that, once an interpretation is chosen, all data begins to confirm what has already been decided. He was seeing a young housekeeper, an isolated elderly couple, cold cash, and the safe in the bedroom that he knew was hidden behind the painting of the Virgin Mary on the wall. A safe his parents swore only they knew existed. Every piece confirmed what he had decided in 5 seconds. "You are extorting my parents," he said. The word fell into the room like a rock into a mirror. Tamara opened her mouth and closed it. Nancy let out a sound between a sigh and a moan. Anthony took a step forward. "That is a lie," Tamara said, and there was fire in her voice now, not rage, but the specific indignation of someone unjustly accused of something that violates everything they are. "I have never in my life taken a cent that wasn't mine. Are you going to tell me you didn't have access to their safe? I have never opened any safe. Then how do you explain?" "I'll explain." Nancy slapped her palm against the arm of the chair with a force everyone in the room felt. For the first time, her voice rose to a volume Henry hadn't heard since childhood. "Henry Augustus Carter, you are going to listen to me now." And it was exactly at that moment that he saw her. His mother standing, her eyes full of a tear she wouldn't let fall, her voice heavy with an emotion that was simultaneously love, pain, and accumulated exhaustion. And along with all that, something he didn't know how to name at the time, but that was a warning. Her chest was rising and falling irregularly, her nostrils flaring slightly with each breath, as if the air wasn't enough. But Henry didn't know how to read that sign. He never had. He was looking at his mother as if he were looking at an obstacle between him and the truth he needed to confirm. "Tamara is not extorting anyone," Nancy said, lower now, her voice forcing a calm that her body was beginning to deny. "This money is for—" "Mom, stop. You don't need to protect her. I get it. You're old, you trust people, it's normal that— Don't call us incapable." Her voice rose again, and this time Henry clearly heard the different sound inside her chest, a subtle, almost imperceptible wheeze that she tried to disguise with the strength of her speech. "We aren't idiots, son. We made a choice. Our choice." A choice that resulted in tens of thousands of dollars stacked in the living room with an employee who has access to everything in this house. An employee who spends Christmases with us because the son who has money for the whole world sends a card over WhatsApp. The words burst out of Nancy like water breaking a dam, with the force of things kept in for too long. And with them came the wheeze again, more audible this time, and she pressed one hand against her chest in a gesture that seemed more reflex than choice. Tamara was the first to notice. She took a quick step toward the elderly woman. "Mrs. Carter, take a deep breath." Henry stepped between the two of them in a movement even he hadn't foreseen. "Don't touch her." Tamara stopped. She looked at Nancy, then at Henry, then back at Nancy, her expression that of someone making a quick calculation about which of the two fronts required more attention. The wheezing in the old woman's chest was audible to anyone who knew how to listen. And Tamara knew how to listen because she had heard it before, other times, and had learned what that sound announced. "She needs her inhaler," Tamara said with an urgency that wasn't a request or a plea. It was information. "She's having an asthma attack." "My mother doesn't have asthma," Henry said. And the silence that followed those 5 words was the specific silence of someone who had just revealed, unintentionally, the extent of their own absence. Anthony closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, there was a sadness in them, so quiet and so deep, it didn't need a voice to be spoken. "She does, son," the old man said softly, "for almost 8 months now, since roughly the last time you were here. We sent you the reports from the clinic." Henry stood motionless for a second that lasted too long. And it was in that second that Nancy, standing beside the chair, reached for the air she couldn't find. The wheezing in Nancy's chest turned into something more serious with the speed of someone who had a medical history her son was completely unaware of. What looked like a moment of agitation converted in a matter of seconds into a real struggle for air. She reached for the back of the armchair with both arms, her knuckles whitening against the fabric, her chest arching forward in that involuntary movement the body makes when it tries to open up as much space as possible for the lungs. The sound coming from her throat was a tight hiss, and the expression on her face shifted rapidly from indignation to something Henry, despite all his emotional blindness, recognized instinctively as real physical suffering. Tamara moved forward again, fast, precise, without hesitation, like someone who had been through this before. "Her inhaler is in the second drawer of the nightstand on the left side of the bed," she said, looking straight at Anthony while bypassing Henry. Go get it, Mr. Carter, go fast. I'll stay with her. The old man was already in motion before she finished the sentence. The familiarity of the instruction confirmed what words didn't need to say. This had happened before, more than once. There was a routine, a protocol of care that existed independently of Henry Carter, built without him, to protect the mother he had left alone. I told you not to touch her. Henry grabbed Tamara's arm. Let go of my arm, she said, her voice low but entirely firm, her eyes on Nancy, who was leaning her body forward in search of air. Mr. Carter, I am trying to help your mother. You are not going to touch my mother. Back off. She's having a crisis. She needs... Back off! He shoved her with a force he hadn't calculated, both hands on her shoulders, and Tamara stumbled back 3 steps, tripping on the Persian rug in front of the armchair. She didn't fall, but she was an inch from it, her arms flinging out instinctively to balance her body. For a fraction of a second they looked at each other, she with that expression he would only understand hours later. He with his jaw locked in the determination of someone who confuses control with protection. Nancy made a sound that wasn't a word. It was just air fighting to exist within a space that was closing. Anthony returned from the bedroom with the inhaler in hand, kneeling beside his wife with a dexterity that came from much practice, placing the device to her lips with the precise tenderness of someone who had done this so many times. The gesture had become a language of love. Breathe, my love. Slowly. With me. I'm right here. Tamara stood where she was. Her eyes went from the old woman to Henry and back to the old woman. There was a decision forming in those eyes. Henry would see it clearly later, when he had time to review every second of that afternoon with the painful clarity of regret. She was choosing between trying to help again and risking being shoved once more, and Nancy's crisis seemed to be being contained by the inhaler and her husband's hands. She needs to be calm, Tamara said, looking at Henry with a voice that didn't beg but instructed. Stress makes it worse. She can't get any more agitated right now. Please. You're giving me orders inside my family's home. I'm giving you medical information about your mother. Information I didn't ask for. Get out of this room. Henry... His father's voice was exhausted. His son's name spoken with that specific tone that is the exhaustion of fatherhood in the face of something fatherhood can no longer correct. Dad, take care of her. I'll handle this. Tamara didn't leave the room. She kept looking at Nancy, ignoring Henry with a concentration he interpreted as defiance, but which was in reality genuine concern. It was the kind of thing you see in the eyes of someone who has loved someone for months and cannot switch that love off at the command of someone who arrived late. Get out of this room now, Henry repeated, his voice dropping 2 octaves, that low frequency his subordinates recognized as the final warning before consequences. I'm not going anywhere until she's stable. He moved. He crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed Tamara's arm with one hand, and walked her to the hallway, then through the kitchen, then down the service corridor that led to the back door. She went with him, not because she didn't resist, but because she understood the alternative was a bigger scene, more noise, more stress inside that room where Nancy was still fighting to breathe. You are making a huge mistake, Tamara said as he pushed open the back door with his shoulder. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. No, you know absolutely nothing. He shoved her outside. The afternoon was overcast with low clouds. The pavement of the alley at the back of the mansion was dark with dampness. Tamara tripped on the 2 steps down and went to her knees on the rough asphalt, the palms of her hands opening to cushion the fall. She stayed like that for a second on her knees, her hair falling from its loose bun, her palms slightly scraped from the friction with the asphalt. When she lifted her face, her eyes were dry. There were no tears. There was something worse, a cold, almost serene clarity that came from someone who already knew the world in the harshest way possible and no longer expected to be surprised by it. Please, she said, and it was the first time Henry heard that tone from her. It wasn't weakness, it was a naked plea that came from somewhere below pride and dignity, from somewhere where only urgency existed. Please, at least don't leave them alone. Stay with them. Don't go anywhere before confirming she's okay. I need you to understand something very important. Mind your own business, he said, At least let me get my things, my phone, my ID. I'll send everything later. You don't understand. I need to go somewhere today. The door is closed to you, Henry said. Don't come back here. She started to say something else, one last attempt, and Henry closed the door. The click of the latch into the strike plate was the most definitive sound he had produced that afternoon. On the other side, the silence of the alley. He stood still for a second with his hand still on the knob, feeling the cold surface of the metal. Then he took a deep breath and went back through the kitchen, down the hall, into the living room. Nancy was leaning back in the chair with her eyes closed, her chest still moving with more effort than it should, but in a more regular rhythm than minutes before. Anthony held her hand with both of his thumbs making a slow, circular motion on the back of his wife's hand, as he had always done since Henry was a boy, in that gesture of practical love that never needed words. His father looked at his son for a long moment. There was an expression in that gaze that Henry refused to meet head-on. It wasn't anger, it was something that hurts more than anger, a deep disappointment, the kind that doesn't scream, that only observes and remembers. "She's going to be fine," Henry said, more to himself than to anyone else. Anthony didn't respond. He turned his eyes back to his wife. The inhaler sat on the arm of the chair between them, a small plastic sentinel that existed because someone had taken the precaution of buying it, keeping it in the right place, and knowing exactly where it was when it was needed, and that someone was not the son who now stood in the middle of the living room with his hands in his suit pockets, looking at the stacks of cash on the mahogany table, with eyes seeking a confirmation that still needed to be sealed. The stacks were there, organized, real, irrefutable. 40 years of accumulated professional mistrust had taught Henry that cold cash never lied, that values outside formal channels were always a symptom of something that needed to be hidden. He looked at those stacks and saw a sentence he himself had written and of which he didn't yet know he was the only defendant. "Dad," he said finally, "the safe in the bedroom. Is it open?" Anthony looked at his son for a time that felt longer than it was. "It's empty," the old man said. "I need to see." And without waiting for an answer, Henry walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, carrying with him the wrong certainty of a man who had never learned to doubt himself when it mattered most. The master bedroom had the specific scent of rooms belonging to people who have slept together for 50 years, a mixture of medicine and old perfume and clean clothes, and something deeper that had no name, but was, if he had to name it, the sum of all the nights two bodies had spent side by side in a small space for too long for it to be anything other than love, built in the everyday. Henry went straight to the wall where the painting of the Virgin Mary hung. 3 decades of muscle memory guided his fingers to the bottom edge of the frame, where there was a discreet tab that, when pressed, released the painting from the wall on an invisible hinge. His memory didn't fail. The painting opened. Behind it was the steel safe. The safe door was open. The interior was empty, except for a folded sheet of paper someone had forgotten or deliberately left, an old inventory of documents, handwritten in Nancy's rounded script, listing what should have been there: the deed to the property, the will, emergency savings. Everything was crossed out. Nothing remained. Henry stared at the empty safe for a time he couldn't measure. The confirmation he expected was there, in the form of absence. To a mind that had decided the narrative, the absence of content didn't raise doubts. It was proof. He closed the safe and the painting with the same movements as before, and left the room with a renewed determination that was, in reality, the hardening of someone who is wrong but doesn't know it yet. The service room was at the end of the side hallway behind the kitchen, in an area that in the architecture of old mansions was called the maid's quarters, and which in practice was a smaller, more austere room, completely separate from the rest of the house in the name of a division of worlds that society had perpetuated for generations. Henry had entered that room only once, years ago, before Tamara, to check if it was in habitable condition. He hadn't been back since. He opened the door without knocking. What he found destabilized him for a second before he regained his veneer of determination. The room was small. Very small. A twin bed, a light wood dresser with the top drawer slightly peeling, a 2-door wardrobe with a cracked mirror in the center. A high window with a simple cream cotton curtain. On the dresser sat a bottle of water, a phone charger, a Bible with a spine so well read it was faded, and a laminated photo leaning against the wall. An older woman with grey hair smiling at the camera, with the eyes of someone who had loved much. There was nothing of value. But Henry opened the dresser drawers one by one, with that investigator's objectivity that is, in practice, violation disguised as purpose. Clothes folded with the care of someone who has few and cherishes each one. A set of simple lingerie, washed so many times the color had faded into an imprecise shade. Documents in a transparent plastic envelope. ID card, social security card, work history booklet with pages filled since she was 18, a vaccination record. Everything organized, everything honest, everything poor. In the wardrobe were 3 pairs of pants, 2 work shirts, a light fabric dress that seemed reserved for occasions different from the everyday, and a pair of white sneakers worn on both sides that someone had tried to clean carefully, but that time had marked beyond what any cleaning could undo. On the top shelf of the wardrobe was a cardboard box taped shut. Henry took it down and opened it without ceremony. Inside, folded with care, were drawings, many of them, made with crayons on printer paper, some on notebook pages, some on the back of water and electricity bills. Houses, trees, 2 adults holding hands, a boy flying over clouds, suns with smiling faces. In all of them, in the bottom right corner, the same childish signature, the letters still shaky but determined, David. Henry looked at the drawings for a second, then he put them back in the box with a movement that was, without him realizing it, slightly more careful than his previous gestures. He closed the wardrobe. There was nothing. No hidden jewelry, no cash, no documents that weren't hers. No proof of anything other than a whole life of dignified poverty, organized by someone who had learned to do much with little. Every object in that room was a negation of what he had decided to see. But a mind that has already chosen a narrative knows how to be surprisingly creative to avoid seeing what contradicts it. He opened the doors under the bed. Nothing but an empty suitcase and a box of medicine. He looked at the dresser again and picked up the notebook that was between the Bible and the water bottle, which he had missed before. He flipped through it. It wasn't a diary. It was a functional notebook of practical notes, schedules for Mr. and Mrs. Carter's medicines written with arrows and circles, cooking recipes copied by hand, a grocery list with prices next to each item, like someone doing the math before reaching the checkout, the emergency number for the medical clinic, the names of doctors for each specialty and their appointment days. Henry closed the notebook and put it back. He stood in the middle of that tiny room for a moment that was longer than he would have admitted. There was something in that space that resisted the narrative he had built. It wasn't the worn clothes or the simple bed or the cracked mirror. It was the organization. It was the care. It was the notebook with his parents' medicine schedules written in the hand of someone who didn't need to write it, who could have forgotten or not bothered or left it for later, but who chose to write it with diligence because to her those 2 elderly people truly mattered. That was what bothered him, not the poverty. It was the evidence, so clear and so uncomfortable, of a care he had failed to provide. There was a hook behind the door. On it hung Tamara's blue work apron, the same one she had probably taken off before sitting with the seniors. In the transition between work and that moment of intimacy, Henry had interrupted. He picked up the apron to look at it, not knowing exactly what he was looking for, moved by an impulse that no longer had the rational clarity of before, but needed something else to justify everything he had done. In the apron pocket, there was something. He felt it with his fingers before he saw it, rigid, folded, with a texture different from the fabric around it. He reached 2 fingers into the pocket and pulled it out. It was an envelope, crumpled at the folds as if it had been read and refolded several times, the paper slightly damp at the edges from the overcast afternoon. In the top left corner was a blue and white crest and a name printed in institutional font, St. Luke's Children's Hospital, Center for High Complexity Cardiac Surgery. Henry Carter stared at the envelope for a long moment, with an expression that was beginning, very slowly, to lose the rigidity he had carried since he walked through the living room door. There was something in that paper that communicated urgency even before it was opened. It was the specific weight of things that matter too much, that don't let the hands stay still, that make the air in the room feel different just by existing. He opened the envelope. The sheet inside was printed on letterhead, with regular margins and an institutional font that transformed what it said into something even more implacable, simply by stating with the coldness of a document what would devastate any human being with a shred of heart still functioning. And Henry Carter, who had spent that entire afternoon trying to prove he had no heart at all, began to read. He read it twice. The first time without being able to completely process it, his eyes passing over the words like someone walking through fog, recognizing the terms but not letting them land where things truly settle. The second time, slowly, forcing each line to sink in. David Rodriguez, 5 years old. Diagnosis: complex congenital heart disease, malformation of multiple valves, progressive heart failure. The document was a final notification issued by the hospital's administrative department, signed by 2 doctors and the director of the priority surgery program. The language was technical, bureaucratic, designed to protect the institution as much as to inform the patient. But what it said, in its essence, was brutal. The boy had been classified as a priority patient in the high-complexity surgical program 4 months ago. The surgery, a correction of the heart valves combined with septal reconstruction, had been postponed twice due to clinical instability and once due to insufficient financial documentation. This was the final notice. The deadline for full payment of the procedure, in the amount of $45,000, was 6 p.m. today. In the event of non-payment by that time, the boy would be removed from the priority program and referred to palliative care, a category reserved for patients whose curative treatment was considered unfeasible for financial reasons. $45,000. Henry lifted his eyes from the page. The service room was silent around him, small and bare as it had always been, with the worn clothes and the crayon drawings and the faded Bible. He looked at the photo of the gray-haired woman on the dresser. He looked at the box he had closed with care with David's drawings inside, the boy flying over clouds, the house with yellow windows, the 2 adults holding hands. He looked at his watch. 4:22 p.m. There was a simple and devastating math there. From the value sitting on the mahogany table in the living room, to the deadline remaining until 6 p.m., to the 5-year-old child in a hospital somewhere in New York, with a heart that didn't work right, but was, until today, still beating. $45,000. The same amount that was stacked in the living room. The same amount his mother had withdrawn from the bank that morning, lucid and determined, in a private ambulance, because her lungs no longer allowed her to walk long distances alone. The same amount Tamara had carried into the mansion with her eyes shining, not with greed, but with relief. The relief of someone who had spent weeks trying to find a way out, and finally saw the exit open. And Henry had thrown that woman out of the house without letting her speak, without letting her take her phone, without letting her take her ID, without letting her take the envelope that was now in his hands. He stood motionless in the room for a second that weighed more than the sum of all the seconds of that afternoon. Then he left, crossed the kitchen, the hallway, and entered the living room. His father was still with Nancy, who was breathing more normally now, her eyes open and fixed on her son with an expression he didn't have the courage to meet for more than an instant. He took his cell phone from his suit pocket and dialed the number for the bank manager. Roger Sales, manager of the premium branch that handled his parents' personal accounts, answered on the second ring with the efficiency of someone who knows you don't keep a client like Henry Carter waiting. "Mr. Carter, good afternoon." "Roger, I need information right now. My mother made a cash withdrawal today. Tell me exactly what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The pause of someone calculating where the privacy protocol ends and where it stops in front of a client who can make their life difficult with one phone call. "Sir, as you know, we have privacy protocols." "Roger, my mother is 71 years old. She withdrew a significant amount in cash without informing me, and there is a situation here I need to understand urgently. Help me, or I call the regional director in the next 30 seconds. Another pause, shorter this time. "Mrs. Carter came in person to the branch at 9:15 a.m., sir. She was lucid, oriented with all the documents. She requested a cash withdrawal of $45,000, an amount available in the couple's savings account. We tried to suggest a wire transfer directly to the hospital, but she explained that the hospital's account had an administrative hang-up and only accepted window payments to release the surgical schedule. We verified the situation with her. She confirmed everything. The operation was legal and entirely voluntary, sir. Was she alone? She hired a private ambulance for transport because you know she has the respiratory issue. 2 ambulance staff accompanied her inside the branch. She signed everything personally. Henry was silent for a moment. On the other end of the line, Roger Salles waited. Did she say anything? Henry said. It wasn't a question, it was the intuition of someone who knew his mother well enough to know Nancy Carter never did anything important without speaking her mind. Roger hesitated. This time the hesitation was of a different nature. Not protocol, but the contained emotion of someone who had seen something and was holding on to it. She cried, Mr. Carter. In my office before signing. She said you had the whole world in your hand, but had left your own parents alone in a big house, while the girl who worked there, having almost nothing, had given them companionship, affection, and real time. And she said that money was finally going to serve something that actually mattered, that it was going to save a child's life. The call ended a few seconds later, but Henry Carter didn't hear the manager's final words. He was looking at the living room, at the money on the table, at his parents in the armchairs, at the envelope in his own hand, with an expression that was, for the first time that afternoon, completely devoid of the armor he had spent 20 years building. 4:31 p.m. 1 hour and 29 minutes left until 6 p.m. New York, outside, was starting to close the sky with those heavy, late afternoon clouds that signaled heavy rain. He knew the city. He knew what happened to the streets of the capital when the rain hit during rush hour. He knew exactly what traffic became between Scarsdale and any high-complexity hospital in lower Manhattan. Henry went to the mahogany table. He picked up the stacks of cash with both hands, without counting, without checking, and put them inside a grocery bag that was folded on the living room chair, one of those reusable bags Nancy kept out of the habit of someone who learned never to waste anything. He tied the bag with a knot. He took the hospital envelope and tucked it inside the bag as well. He looked at his father. Anthony Carter looked back at his son with that expression Henry would carry forever. There was no anger in that look. There was something harder to carry. There was waiting, the quiet weight of someone who believes, despite everything, that the son he raised is still in there, inside the man he didn't recognize. I'm going to fix this, Henry said, and it was the first true thing he had said since he walked through the mansion door. He ran out the front door, leaving the wine bag with the crumpled gold ribbon on the hallway floor. Outside, Charles was still waiting beside the armored SUV. Henry opened the car door before the driver could move. St. Luke's Children's Hospital, as fast as possible. Charles got in, activated the GPS and pulled away. The first drops of rain began to hit the windshield as the car entered the highway, and Henry looked at the clock on the dashboard. 4:37 p.m. 83 minutes. That was all that stood between David's heart and a fate Henry Carter, without knowing it, had almost sealed with his own hands. The traffic in New York at 4:40 p.m. on a Thursday with imminent rain was exactly what anyone who knew the city would expect. A nightmare. Charles tried 3 different routes in the first 10 minutes, and all 3 were gridlocked. The GPS recalculated every 2 blocks with that algorithmic coldness of someone who was never truly in a hurry. Henry sat in the back seat with the grocery bag in his lap and the hospital envelope in his hand, staring through the tinted glass with the eyes of someone measuring distance in minutes, not miles. 4:50 p.m., 70 minutes left. Charles, cut through the park. It's blocked too, sir. There's an accident near 72nd Street. Then take the West Side Highway. The West Side is backed up from the bridge. There's a protest near the Lincoln Tunnel. Cars are all diverting to... Then find a way, Charles. Henry's voice rose for the first time without being strategic, without being calculated for effect. It was pure desperation, shapeless, the kind of thing he hadn't produced in years, because for years there had been nothing urgent enough to dismantle him like this. Charles went quiet and turned right onto a secondary street Henry didn't recognize. The car moved for 3 blocks before coming to a complete stop behind a line of vehicles that wasn't moving. The rain truly started at that moment, not the scattered drops from before, but the full force of a New York downpour, that dense, noisy curtain that turned streets into rivers and windshields, into blurred screens of everything outside. The headlights of the cars in line became fuzzy orange dots in the mist of water. Charles turned the wipers to maximum speed, and they swept the glass with a mechanical urgency that solved nothing. 5:02 p.m. 58 minutes. Henry opened the car door. "Sir," Charles said, turning back with the expression of someone who knows his boss well enough to know what's about to happen is a bad idea, but lacks the authority to stop it. "You can go," Henry said. "Or wait, it doesn't matter." He stepped out. The rain soaked him in less than 10 seconds. The Italian-tailored suit, which had cost more than 5 times Tamara's monthly salary, clung to his body in an instant. The perfect Windsor knot of his tie came undone in the water. His leather shoes absorbed the puddle that took up half the sidewalk before he reached the other side of the street. Henry clutched the grocery bag with the $45,000 against his chest with both hands, as if it were the most valuable thing he had ever carried, which for the first time in his life was literally true. He started to run. New York in the late afternoon rain was a city of umbrellas and horns and water spray kicked up by bus wheels and the smell of wet earth and hot asphalt. Henry cut through the sidewalks, dodged pedestrians, jumped puddles, passed under store awnings that offered a brief second of shelter before he dove back into the rain. His lungs began to ache after 2 blocks, not the elegant ache of a gym runner, but the honest pain of a body that wasn't conditioned for this, that had spent the last years in armored cars and private elevators, and was finally being taxed for it. He didn't stop. He remembered, unintentionally, the moment he had thrown Tamara out the door. How she had fallen to her knees on the asphalt exactly like this, knees on the wet ground, palms open. And now it was him, metaphorically on his knees, running through a city that asked no permission and cleared no path for anyone, rich or poor, arrogant or humble, in a soaked suit or a blue apron. At the corner of the next avenue, a delivery truck had double parked, blocking the entire block, and cars were trying to squeeze through the only available lane, creating a knot no driver would admit to helping tie. Henry darted through the gap between the parked cars without thinking, trying to reach the other side of the avenue, and a car's side mirror hit his elbow hard enough to spin his body half a step and make him trip on the curb. He fell. His palms hit the wet asphalt. The bag was crushed under his chest for an instant of a fall that felt longer than it was. He got up. There was a cut on his right palm, long and red, which the rain was already diluting into a pinkish color that ran down his wrist and dripped onto the asphalt before being absorbed by the water. He looked at his hand for a second, then pressed the bag against his chest, adjusted his route on the GPS on his phone, which had miraculously stayed in his pocket, and resumed running. 5:23 p.m., 37 minutes. There was a knot in Henry Carter's throat that he couldn't swallow, and that wasn't caused by physical exertion. It was something different, older. The specific pressure of things that should have been said and weren't, of actions that should have been taken and weren't, of an absence that had cost more than he had the courage to calculate until now. His mother in the ambulance, alone, going to the bank to withdraw the money he had never bothered to offer. His father holding his wife's hand in the service room while he destroyed the quarters of a woman who had spent a whole year taking care of the 2 of them. David's crayon drawings, the boy flying over clouds. He ran faster. The hospital appeared on the 3rd Avenue after the roundabout. At a corner he recognized on the GPS half a second before rounding the curve. It was a white building with a blue facade, 6 stories high, with an illuminated sign that said St. Luke's Children's Hospital, in a rounded font that seemed chosen deliberately not to frighten children. At the main entrance was a portico with a covering that didn't reach the sidewalk, and 2 people with umbrellas were waiting for an Uber at the curb. Henry reached the main door at 5:42 p.m. He entered dripping wet. The reception area was wide, with warm colors, animal murals painted on the walls, the kind of design that exists to transform terror into something bearable. The receptionist looked at him, at the soaked suit, at the blood diluted in the water still dripping from his hand, at the crumpled grocery bag he clutched to his chest, with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to professional protocol. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" "No." He leaned over the counter, still breathing with effort. "I need to make a payment. Urgent. David Rodriguez, 5 years old. Cardiology, priority surgical program. The deadline expires at 6 p.m. The receptionist typed again. Made a 30-second internal call in a voice low enough for him not to hear. Then she looked at him. "Are you a relative, sir?" "No." A pause. "Do you have an authorization from the patient's guardian?" Henry opened the bag on the counter. The stacks of cash appeared under the cold light of the reception ceiling, damp at the edges but intact. $45,000 piled on the counter of a children's hospital, placed there by hands still bleeding slightly from an asphalt fall. "I have the money," he said, "and I have 18 minutes. Tell me where to sign." The receptionist picked up the phone again. This time the call was longer, and it was at that moment that Henry saw out of the corner of his eye through the side glass door that led to the external access corridor of the administrative block, a familiar figure. She was sitting on the damp ground of the hospital's back alley, leaning against the white tile wall with her back curved, knees tucked against her chest, arms wrapped around her legs, her hair completely undone from the rain that had soaked her. She wasn't crying. She was just rocking her body slightly back and forth in an automatic, rhythmless motion, the motion of someone who has exhausted every form of reaction the body knows and is left only with that. Tamara. The receptionist was still on the phone when Henry walked out through the side corridor without explaining where he was going. The door to the external alley was aluminum with a panic bar, and he pushed it open with his shoulder in a movement that echoed through the empty hallway. The rain had slowed to a fine, persistent drizzle that didn't soak with the brutality of before, but covered everything in that dense dampness that is almost worse because it doesn't even give the satisfaction of a real storm. Tamara didn't move when she heard the door. She kept her knees against her chest, her arms around her legs, her face half hidden by the wet hair that had fallen over her shoulders. Only when the footsteps stopped near her did she lift her head. The gaze that met Henry's was different from any look she had cast his way all afternoon. There was no longer indignation, nor the firmness of someone who refuses to bend. There was only the naked bottom of a person who had reached the end of their strength and found nothing else on the other side. "I paid," Henry said. His voice sounded different in the alley, raw, like a note played without an instrument. She blinked, once, slowly. "You paid." At 5:51 p.m., the receptionist is confirming with the office now. The money is there. Tamara stared at him for a moment that was much longer than the seconds it lasted. Then she closed her eyes. The hands holding her knees loosened slightly, her fingers opening like someone letting go of something they had held for too long. Her body made a movement that was simultaneously collapse and relief, the two things joined and indistinguishable, and she pressed her forehead against her knees and stayed like that. Henry stood in the alley. The drizzle fell on him. His suit was ruined. His tie had vanished at some point during the run, likely caught on a car mirror or a tree branch he had brushed without noticing. The palm of his right hand had stopped bleeding but was red and raw. He looked at her for an instant and then turned his eyes back to Tamara. "I need to tell you something," he said. She didn't lift her head. "You don't have to listen. I just need to say it." He took a deep breath, the cold alley air smelling of rain and wet concrete entering his lungs with that clarity that open air has after being closed off for a long time. "I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that there is no right word to name. I walked into that house today with 20 years of accumulated arrogance and decided what I was seeing before I had the right to decide anything. I shoved you. I threw your things in the street. I threatened things I had no right to threaten, and I did all that knowing I was their son and thinking that gave me some authority I don't have." Silence. The drizzle. The distant noise of the city. "The safe was empty because my mother went to the bank this morning." He continued, because stopping now would be more cowardly than continuing. "The money on the table was for David. My mother went by ambulance because her lungs are getting worse, and I didn't read the medical reports. I never read them. It's been 8 months since I showed up. And on the day I did this." Tamara lifted her head. Her eyes were red around the dark irises, not from crying, but the specific kind of red that comes from holding back tears for too long. Her chin trembled slightly, and she let it tremble, not trying to hold it, as if at that moment there was no more energy available even for that. "David," she said, and the voice came out with the fragility of someone who needs to know before anything else. "He's in. The payment was accepted. They're going to get in touch with you to sign the surgical authorizations." Henry paused. "He's going to be operated on today. That's what I understood from the receptionist." Her eyes closed again. For 5 seconds, 10, she stayed like that, breathing the cold alley air with a slowness that was active recovery, the kind of breathing you do when the body needs to believe the danger has passed before it can function normally again. Then she opened her eyes, braced her hands on the wet ground, and stood up. Her knees were purple from sitting on the concrete. She was barefoot, Henry noticed only then. She had lost one of her sandals at some point in the day. "I need to go in," she said. "Yes." She walked toward the door. She stopped in front of Henry, who was in the middle of the alley. There was 5 feet of distance between them and the sum of everything that had happened that afternoon, which was simultaneously very little space and too much weight to fit in a hospital alley. "You threw me out without letting me speak," she said. It wasn't an accusation now. It was just the clear naming of a fact, spoken with the voice of someone who needed to say it once so she could put it away. "Yes," he said. "You destroyed my room." "Yes. You threatened to take my son away from me." The word hung in the air. Henry didn't close his eyes or look away. Receiving that was the minimum. It was less than the minimum. "I threatened and I had no right, and it shames me in a way I don't know how to express in words." She stared at him for a moment, with that specific expression of someone evaluating if a person who hurt them deserves to receive back something that cost a great deal. Then she passed him and went through the door. In the reception area, the activity had increased. A nurse had been called to the counter, and there was a man in a white lab coat who seemed to be from administration with a clipboard in his hand and a radio on his belt. When Tamara entered, one of the nurses recognized her name and went toward her with the gentle urgency of someone with good information to give. Henry stood near the entrance, the empty grocery bag folded in his hand, the payment receipt in the pocket of his soaked suit. There was an orange plastic chair in the waiting area, the kind that exists in every hospital waiting room. Hard, with aluminum legs and a seat slightly worn in the center. He went to it and sat down. The waiting room had 4 other people. An older woman knitting with the tranquil speed of someone who had waited in many places in her life. A young couple holding hands without speaking, staring at nothing with the specific look of someone on the other side of a door they cannot open. A boy of about 8 sleeping, wrapped in his mother's coat, with the unconscious naturalness of someone who hasn't yet learned to fear hospitals. Tamara returned to the waiting room 16 minutes later. She had washed her face, and one of the nurses was beside her, having lent her a pair of socks and offered a pair of disposable hospital slippers, the white foam ones that exist for exactly this. She sat 2 chairs away from Henry. He was already ready to go into the operating room, she said, eyes looking forward. "I got there in time to see him." "How was he?" She took a second to respond. "Scared, but trying not to show it." "He does that." A pause. "He's 5 years old and has already learned to hold back his fear, so he doesn't scare me more." Her voice broke slightly at that last part, and she pressed her lips together for a second before continuing. "He asked if Grandma Nancy had sent the money." Henry looked to the side. At her. "What did you say?" She took a while to answer. When she spoke, her voice had that specific texture of things said when the full truth would be too complex for a moment that calls for simplicity. "I said Grandma Nancy and the angels helped, and that a gentleman also arrived in time." Henry stared at her for a moment. Then he turned his eyes forward to the hospital wall with the mural of colorful animals. A blue elephant, a yellow giraffe, a lion with a mane that looked more like a sun. The rain tapped lightly against the high windows of the waiting room. He settled into the orange plastic chair. He put his elbows on his knees, he lowered his head, and he waited. The hours inside a hospital waiting room have a different duration than the hours of the outside world. They don't pass more slowly just because anxiety stretches them, but because inside those spaces time loses the pretension of being useful and becomes merely presence. You are there. Time is passing. That is all that can be said for certain. It was 7 p.m. when the older woman who was knitting packed up her yarn, folded the knitting carefully inside her bag, and stood up. She smiled discreetly at no one in particular, with that serenity of someone who had received good news, and left. The young couple was called by a nurse at 7:20 p.m. They left embracing in a cry that was clearly one of relief. The 8-year-old boy woke up, looked around with blinking, sleepy eyes, and was pulled to his feet by his mother, who arrived hurried down the hall with a huge smile and a juice box in her hand. Henry and Tamara remained in the waiting room. They didn't speak for the first 2 hours. Not out of hostility, but because there was nothing to say that didn't demand more than either of them was capable of offering at that moment. She stayed with her eyes sometimes closed, sometimes fixed on the animal mural on the wall, sometimes drifting to the door of the surgical corridor, as if her gaze could reach what her feet could not. He stayed with his head down most of the time, elbows on his knees, his injured palm turned upward on his thigh like a question without an answer. At 9 p.m., a hospital volunteer passed by with a cart offering coffee and crackers. She was a woman of about 60, with completely white hair, and the kind of smile only someone who chose a job that doesn't pay in money has. Tamara took the coffee with a genuine thank you. Henry took one too, and the heat of the styrofoam cup on his injured palm was the first physical sensation that pulled him out of himself in at least the last 2 years. "How long have you been here?" Tamara asked. Her voice carried no aggression. It was just the voice of someone who finally decided to fill the silence with something. "Since 5:42 p.m. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:15 p.m. "You don't need to stay." "I know. I'm saying you can go." "I know I can," he said. "I'm choosing to stay." She didn't respond to that. She drank her coffee in silence for a moment. Then, "David's heart has 2 problems at once. One of the valves never formed right and the septum has a hole that kept growing. Since he was born. I knew since he was 2 months old. I went to a clinic because he would turn purple when he cried hard. The doctor sent me straight here." Her voice was flat, narrative, the way someone who has told this story many times to many ears finds in that repetition a way to make it bearable. But beneath the flatness, there was a texture that was the real weight of each word. 3 years waiting on the state list. I got a spot in their private program through a social worker, but then I needed part of the amount. I kept saving. It wasn't enough. My mother contributed what she had, which was little. I took overtime at another house on weekends for 6 months. It didn't reach. Mrs. Carter found out because David got sick in September and I had to take him to the ER at night. She saw me leaving with him in my arms at 2 in the morning, so she asked, and I told her. She insisted on knowing everything, and when she knew, she stayed silent for a whole day. Henry listened without interrupting. It was a skill he had developed in negotiations, knowing when staying quiet and listening was more strategic than speaking. Only now there was no strategy. It was just a man listening to another person for real, perhaps for the first time in a long time. Mrs. Carter didn't say anything to me. A week later, she called me into the living room and said she and Mr. Carter had decided. I cried. I fought. I said I couldn't accept. She looked at me with that expression of hers and said that a child you raise is a child nonetheless, and that David was her grandson, and that was that. A child you raise is a child nonetheless. Henry stayed with that phrase for a moment before the next part arrived. They treat me like a daughter, Tamara said, and there was a specific weight in that phrase she left in the air without elaborating. She didn't need to. The contrast was implicit, suspended between her words and his presence there, soaked, injured, arriving late to a family that had existed without him. I didn't know, Henry said, and it sounded hollow even to himself. No, you didn't know. She turned her face to him for the first time in hours. But you could have known. The reports arrived every month. Your father asked me to help him write emails to you because his vision got worse and he can't see the keyboard clearly. I helped write 3. She paused. You answered one. The silence that followed that had a different density. Henry looked at his empty coffee cup, then at the palm of his hand, then at the animal mural on the wall, the blue elephant, the giraffe, the lion with the sun mane. He had helped build the Carter Tower. He had closed deals in Dubai, London, Tokyo. He had been called a visionary, a strategist, a man who saw beyond what others saw. And he had let his father ask an employee for help to write an email because he could no longer see the keyboard. I failed them, he said. Not to Tamara, not to anyone in particular. It was a confession out loud, the kind you make when the truth gets too heavy to stay inside. Yes, she said, without cruelty, just confirmation. And I failed you today. She didn't respond to that. It wasn't the kind of thing you confirm out loud out of charity. It was the kind of thing that sat between people as a fact both knew and that one day, perhaps with much work, would transform into something else. But not that night. At 10:40 p.m., Henry's phone rang. It was his father. He answered immediately. "Dad!" "My son." Anthony Carter's voice had that nocturnal quality of the elderly who do not sleep when something is pending, raspier, closer to the real. "Your mother is fine. She's sleeping. She kept asking for news of David all night." "David is still in surgery. I'm here in the waiting room with Tamara." A pause on the other side. Not of surprise, but of something that was almost relief. "You're there with her?" "I am." Another pause. Longer. "Stay with her, son. She shouldn't be alone at a time like this." Henry looked sideways at Tamara, who was staring at the door of the surgical corridor with that concentration of someone who wants their gaze to arrive before their footsteps. He thought about how many hours she had been there before he showed up, how the security guards had kicked her out for having no ID or phone or identification because he had withheld or destroyed everything, how she had stayed in the back alley, not knowing if anyone would pay, unable to enter, unable to do anything but rock her body in silence with a heart that wasn't David's, but that surely was also broken at that moment. "I'll stay, Dad," he said. "Get some sleep. I'll call with news." He hung up. He turned slightly in the chair toward Tamara. "My mother is fine," he said. "My father sent word that she kept asking about David." Tamara closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was something in them that was simultaneously tenderness and sadness, mixed in a way that had no name, but that anyone who has loved much and lost a little would recognize immediately. "She is the best person I have ever known in my life," Tamara said very softly. "I know," Henry said, and for the first time in many years he sounded like someone who actually knew, not as a file entry, as a felt truth. The waiting room went silent again, but it was a different silence than 2 hours ago. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at the same place by completely opposite paths and who now, sitting in orange plastic chairs in a children's hospital in New York, were discovering that the same place could be inhabited by both at the same time. The rain had stopped outside, the surgical corridor remained closed, and David's heart somewhere behind that door continued to be worked on by hands that knew what they were doing. Midnight passed with a deceptive tranquility, as if the city outside knew there were things happening inside St. Luke's Children's Hospital that didn't ask for noise. The New York of the early morning was a different version of the city Henry had learned to dominate. Without the traffic, without the horns, without the crowds compressed on the sidewalks, the city showed its bones, the concrete and the neon lights, and the few cars that cut through the wide avenues with the speed of those who could finally move without asking permission. Henry hadn't slept. Tamara hadn't either. Between them was the common vigil of those waiting for something that cannot be hurried, that will happen in its own time, and you are there only as a witness and a presence. At 12:45 a.m., Tamara said, "Do you know you have a 5-year-old son who spends the whole day drawing houses?" Henry looked at her. "I saw the drawings, in the box in the wardrobe." She nodded slightly, without resentment, at the memory that he had searched her room. There were more urgent things than resentment now. He draws houses because one day, I don't know where the idea came from, he decided that when he grows up, he's going to build a huge house where everyone can live together. Grandma Nancy, Grandpa Anthony, me, and all the friends he's still going to have. With a big garden and a tree to climb. She paused. He talks about it as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if you just grow up and the house appears. Henry was silent for a moment. What is he like? Tamara turned her face to him with an expression that was simultaneously a mother's pride and something more vulnerable than pride. Stubborn. Very. When he decides he wants to learn something, he stays at it until he learns. Last month he wanted to learn to tie his own shoes. He spent 3 days trying until he got it. Then he came running to show me as if he'd discovered the cure for some disease. Her voice dropped lower. He has the ugliest laugh in the world. He sounds like a duck. He knows it himself and laughs at his own laugh. Henry felt something move in his own chest that he didn't know how to name, but recognized as the specific movement of a place that had been closed for a long time and was being opened by information that wasn't for him, but reached him nonetheless. "And his father?" he asked, after hesitating over whether he should. "He's not in the picture," Tamara said simply, without bitterness, without drama. It was a sentence that closed a door without a lock. "Since I was 3 months pregnant, never again." Henry nodded. He didn't ask for more details. He had learned that night that there are questions that decency forbids asking after a certain hour. At 1:12 a.m., Tamara got up to go to the bathroom. Henry was left alone in the waiting room, which had returned to being completely empty except for him. The volunteer with the coffee cart had passed for the last time at 11 p.m. and hadn't returned. The ceiling light had that specific quality of nighttime hospital lighting, white, uniform, shadowless, making everything raw. He took out his phone. He had 27 unread notifications, messages from Roger about the cancelled 6 p.m. meeting, emails from Dubai scheduling a follow-up for the following week, a message from Fiona saying simply, "Sir, I am available if you need anything." He looked at the screen for a moment and put it away without responding to any. He took out the payment receipt he had kept in his pocket. The paper was slightly crumpled and damp at the edges, but the amount was legible. $45,000, full payment, release protocol for the surgical procedure issued at 5:56 p.m. 4 minutes before the deadline. He had arrived with a 4-minute margin on a deadline Tamara had spent months trying to reach, that his mother had tried to reach with the lungs she had, that his father had tried to reach with the resources he had left. 4 minutes. He folded the receipt and put it back in his pocket, with a care he hadn't afforded any document in a long time. When Tamara returned, there was a subtle difference in her face, the difference of someone who spent a few minutes alone doing what they couldn't do in front of another person. Her eyes weren't red, but there was the lightness of someone who cried quickly and truly, and came back lighter than they went. She sat in the same chair as before. She stayed silent. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said. "You can." "In the alley when I closed the door in your face, what were you trying to tell me?" She stared forward for a long moment before answering. "That the deadline was 6 p.m. That if you didn't let me in to get the envelope, I wouldn't have any way to prove anything, because my phone was in there and my ID too. That I needed at least the envelope to go to the hospital." Pause. "And that, please, you should stay with them. That your mother was doing poorly and she needed to be calm." "Did you have time to say all that?" "No." "You closed the door." Henry stared at the palm of his hand open on his knee. The cut had closed, but the mark was there, red and honest. "How long did you stay in the alley before coming here?" he asked. "Almost 2 hours. I banged on the back door several times, tried the front too. Then I tried to ask a neighbor for their phone to call the hospital and say I was coming, but no one opened. I walked here." She paused. "A 45-minute walk. Barefoot?" "I lost a sandal in the rain." Henry was silent for a time he couldn't measure. "When I got here," she continued, with the same flat voice of someone narrating what they went through as an exercise in processing, "I didn't have ID or money or a phone. Security wouldn't let me in. I tried to explain. I tried 3 times. On the 3rd, the guard escorted me to the exit with his hand on my arm." She said nothing more after that. She didn't need to. The image was complete. Tamara Rodriguez, barefoot, soaked, without ID, without a phone, without anything but the urgency no one saw, being removed from the hospital where her son was waiting for her. At 2:11 a.m., the doors to the surgical corridor opened. The surgeon who walked out was a man in his 50s with his mask still hanging around his neck and his glasses pushed up on his forehead, his coat bearing the specific marks of 7 hours of intense work. He looked at the waiting room, located Tamara by the photograph that had been registered at entry, and walked toward her with steps that were professional, but with eyes that communicated before his words. Tamara stood up in a jump. Henry stood up too, without thinking, in an involuntary reflex of someone who was in this together. The surgeon reached them and took a deep breath. "Are you David Rodriguez's mother?" "I am," Tamara said, and her voice came out smaller than she must have wanted. "The procedure was concluded with complete success," the doctor said. "All corrections were performed as planned. David's heart is beating strong and stable on its own. He's in the ICU for routine monitoring, but the prognosis is excellent. Tomorrow morning you can already see him." What happened to Tamara in the following 3 seconds was the kind of thing that has no adequate word in any language, because it is entirely physical. The body giving way after holding on for too long, the knees buckling slightly, the shoulders dropping from the place they had stayed held high for months. She didn't fall, but she stayed suspended for an instant between standing and letting go. And it was in that instant that Henry Carter placed his hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a hug. It was just a man's hand on the shoulder of a woman who had carried more than she should for longer than was fair. But she didn't pull her shoulder away, and for a moment, there in the empty waiting room of St. Luke's Children's Hospital, at 2:11 a.m. on a Friday morning, the two of them stayed like that while the surgeon finished speaking about the recovery protocol. At 3:30 a.m., the same hour Henry Carter had been on a plane back from Tokyo the year before, completely indifferent to the world he had left behind, he was sitting in an orange plastic chair beside a woman who had taught him more about what matters than all the years of business and conquests and accumulated fortunes before that day. And he cried. For the first time in 15 years, without an audience, without strategy, without any reason other than that there was, finally, something that deserved to be cried for. Dawn arrived for Henry Carter through the high window of the waiting room, as it arrives for those who haven't slept, not as a revelation, but as a continuation. The sky shifted from deep grey to light grey, to that washed-out pink that New York offers, when there are no clouds covering the horizon. And there was something in that silent gradient that seemed, for the first time in a long time, like a language he understood. Tamara had dozed off around 4 a.m., leaning sideways on the chairs with her legs tucked, using the coat lent by a nurse as a pillow. She slept with that honest concentration of someone who has no anxiety about appearance, with her mouth slightly open and her face completely relaxed by the relief that fatigue and good news together had produced. Henry hadn't slept. He stayed beside her through the whole night with his phone on silent and his head occupied by an honest inventory of the years he had built and what those years had cost the people who should have been at the center of everything. His father trying to write emails with failing vision. His mother in an ambulance going to the bank alone because her lungs wouldn't let her do otherwise. Tamara carrying the weight of a hospital bill that wasn't hers while taking care of 2 seniors with the kind of presence he had long ago outsourced. And David, 5 years old with a heart that needed fixing, drawing huge houses where everyone fit. At 6:40 a.m., Henry left the waiting room in silence so as not to wake Tamara and went to the vending machine corridor he had seen at the entrance. He bought 2 coffees, 2 packs of crackers, and a bottle of water. He returned. He placed her chair on the chair beside her, where she would see it when she woke and drank his coffee standing up, looking through the window at the New York that was beginning to fill with movement. At 7:15 a.m., Tamara woke up. For a second she was disoriented, looking around with the eyes of someone needing an instant to remember where they are and why. Then she remembered, and her face opened into an expression that was the exact opposite of what he had seen on that same face throughout the previous afternoon. She saw the coffee and crackers beside her. She looked at Henry. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. "It's nothing." She drank the coffee slowly, without hurry, looking at the window with that quietude of someone inside, a moment they know is important and don't want to waste. Then she took the pack of crackers, opened it, ate two, and offered them to him. He took one. "Do you go to the hospital every day?" he asked. "Every day I can. When I stay with your father and mother at night, sometimes I can't, but then I call." A pause. "He'll be hospitalized for at least 2 weeks after the surgery, then at least 3 months of outpatient follow-up. But they said after that it's a normal life, completely normal." Henry stayed with that phrase. Normal life. For a child who had never had, since 2 months of age, the guarantee that life would be normal. "I want to tell you something," he said, looking at the window. "It's not an apology, because an apology doesn't undo what was done. It's just what needs to be said." Tamara drank her coffee and waited. "I'm going to ensure David has everything he needs until he's completely recovered, and beyond that, follow-ups, medicine, cardiac physical therapy, whatever is necessary. Not as payment for what I did, because there is no equivalent value, but because it's the right thing to do, and because I can do it, and I should have been doing right things with what I have for a long time." "I don't need charity," Tamara said, and there was a thread of that old dignity returning to her voice. "I know." He finally turned his face to her. "You didn't need anything from me at any point in your life. You built everything you have from nothing. I'm talking about responsibility. It's different." She stared at him for a moment. The kind of look that measures the distance between what a person says and what a person is. Then she nodded slightly. Not as total acceptance, not as forgiveness, as the beginning of a possibility. At 8:20 a.m., a nurse entered the waiting room and said David was awake and asking for his mother. Tamara stood up so fast she almost knocked over the chair. The nurse smiled and gestured for them to follow. In the corridor leading to the pediatric ICU, Henry instinctively slowed his pace, leaving space between him and the 2 women ahead. It was the right instinct. That moment belonged to Tamara and her son. He was a lateral presence, not the protagonist, and for the first time in decades, being the lateral presence didn't diminish him. It made sense. It made the sense things make when they are in the right place. He stayed outside the room while the nurse opened the door. He heard from outside a child's voice. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The tone of someone who saw the person they loved most in the world and wanted to be sure she was real before anything else. And he heard Tamara respond with that voice mothers have, which has no description other than being the exact opposite of fear. Henry leaned against the hospital corridor wall with his arms crossed over his ruined suit, his shoes still damp from the previous day's puddles, the palm of his hand with the cut that was healing. He closed his eyes for a moment. He prayed. He wasn't quite sure to what, nor was he certain there was anything that heard prayers, but he did it anyway because there were things that needed to be said in an internal voice, and that fit in no other form but that. He asked for David, for the recovery that had already begun, for the parents waiting for him at home, for Tamara, who had carried more than was fair for longer than she should, and for himself, not the Henry who had walked through the mansion door the previous afternoon, but the Henry who was discovering outside a pediatric ICU room that he had arrived at the most important place in his life, completely unprepared, and that this, despite everything, was still in time. After a few minutes, the door to the room opened. Tamara came out with her eyes shining in a way that was completely different from every time they had shone throughout the previous afternoon. "He wants to see you," she said. Henry started to respond and stopped. He pointed to himself with a gesture that was pure question. "Me?" "He said he wants to see the gentleman who arrived in time." She paused. "I told him you were out here waiting." He stared at her for a second. Then he uncrossed his arms, mechanically straightened the suit that could no longer be straightened, and went in. David was in a bed too high for his size, with a catheter in the back of his hand and monitoring wires taped to his chest, but with eyes open and alive with that specific luminosity of children who haven't yet learned to hide what they feel. He was exactly as Henry had imagined from the drawings: curly, messy hair, a snub nose. The duck laugh Tamara had described was tucked away for now, but there was in the curve of his mouth the sketch of it. The boy looked at Henry with the seriousness of someone making an important evaluation. "Are you the gentleman?" David said. "I am," Henry said, stopping at the foot of the bed. "Mommy said you helped." "I helped a little." David considered that. "Do you know Grandma Nancy?" "I do. She's my mother." The boy's eyes widened slightly, processing that information with the mathematical sincerity of a 5-year-old. "So you're Mommy's brother?" Tamara, beside the bed, made a sound that was half sigh and half stifled laugh. Henry stared at the boy for a moment, at that small, serious face that had survived a night of heart surgery and was now processing genealogies with the same concentration as someone tying their shoes for the first time. "Not exactly," Henry said, "but I can be the uncle." David looked at his mother as if asking for confirmation. Tamara, eyes bright, nodded slightly. The boy turned his eyes back to Henry and offered his free hand, the one without the catheter, with the solemnity of a child who had learned at some point that a handshake was the adult way to seal an important deal. Henry Carter, multimillionaire businessman, founder of the Carter Tower, a man who had negotiated contracts on 4 continents, leaned over the bed and carefully squeezed that small, confident hand. And he felt, in the firm grip of 5 tiny fingers, something no contract had given and no fortune had bought, the specific weight of a trust that hadn't been earned but was being offered nonetheless, with the irresponsible and perfect generosity that only exists entirely in children. Henry arrived at the Scarsdale mansion at 9:40 a.m. the next morning, with his suit ruined, his shoes carrying the memory of the previous day's puddles, and the palm of his hand healing from a fall that had been necessary to teach him what 20 years of success had failed to. The gate was open. The path of oaks received the morning light, which had forgotten the previous day's clouds and returned to the harsh, golden clarity of New York on a weekend. The flowers he hadn't known how to name the previous afternoon were yellow dogwoods that the gardener had planted along the wall, and they were fully open that morning, vibrating with that impossible color that seems more like paint than nature. The main door was ajar. When he entered, the hallway with the photographs received him as always, quiet and full of accumulated memory. This time he looked, the graduation photo framed with Nancy's excessive pride that he had found tacky at 24, the portrait of the trip to Georgia, his father younger than he remembered, smiling at the camera with a disarmed joy that was exactly the joy he had seen on his father's face the previous afternoon, before he destroyed it. Himself at 6 years old in front of this very door, in a school uniform with a scraped knee, and the expression of a child who didn't yet know the world collected a toll. That boy was still here. He had passed through layers of suits and contracts and meetings and numbers until he became almost invisible, but he had spent the whole night surfacing while Henry waited in an orange plastic chair and heard about a boy who drew houses where everyone fit. "Son," the voice came from the living room. Anthony Carter was in the hallway doorway in pajamas, with the leather slippers he had always worn, his white hair messy from interrupted sleep, and in his eyes that expression Henry had seen the night before over the phone and now up close, recognized completely. It was waiting. The quiet weight of a father who never stopped believing in his son, even when the son stopped deserving it. Henry went to him, and for the first time since he had crossed that door 24 hours earlier, he said nothing. He hugged his father. Not with the quick, protocol-driven hug of an obligatory visit, with 3 pats on the back and his body already turning to leave. He hugged him for real with the weight of a man who had arrived late but had arrived, and he felt his father's hug return with a strength surprising for a 74-year-old man, Anthony's arms closing around his son's back with the firmness of things that do not change, even when they should. "David came out of surgery well," Henry said, his voice muffled by his father's shoulder. "I know," Anthony said. "Tamara called at 8 a.m. from a phone borrowed from a nurse. Your mother cried so much she soaked the bedsheets." They both laughed slightly, the kind of laugh that comes out of crying and is more honest than either of the two things separately. In the bedroom, Nancy was sitting in bed, propped up against the pillows with her inhaler beside her, and a cup of tea in her hand that one of the private nurses had left on the nightstand. When Henry entered, she looked at him without saying anything for a moment. That mother's look that reads the whole sun in 3 seconds, and needs no word to confirm what she already knows. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her hand with both of his. "Mom," he said. And he stopped because there was nothing after that which was sufficient and nothing that was unnecessary. Her name spoken like that, alone, with the weight of everything inside, was the longest prayer he knew how to say. Nancy placed her cup on the nightstand and put her free hand over her son's hands. "You went," she said. It wasn't a question or a compliment. It was the simple naming of a fact that mattered too much to be ornamented. "I went, and you arrived in time. By 4 minutes." She closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was a peace in them that wasn't resignation. It was the peace of one who planted a seed and saw it sprout. "You knew," he said, "that I wouldn't read the envelope if you simply told me. If you had told me through Fiona or by email, I would have found a reason not to act." "I knew," she said simply. He looked at his mother, who had hired an ambulance with the lungs that prevented her from walking long distances, who had gone to the bank and cried before the manager with a moral clarity that shamed any corporate logic, who had waited for her son to arrive in that room not out of longing, but for the only reason he would be capable of seeing: the money on the table, which would serve as the trigger for him to search and find the envelope and arrive, in some twisted and painful and completely necessary way, at the truth. "You know me too well," he said. "I'm your mother," she replied. And there was in those 3 words a vastness that Henry spent the whole morning trying to measure and never could. The 6 months that followed were the slowest and most honest reconstruction Henry Carter had ever undertaken. There was no single conversation of complete forgiveness, nor a grand gesture of redemption that erased everything at once. There was instead presence. Every Wednesday and Saturday, Henry appeared at the Scarsdale mansion with no later agenda, without Charles waiting outside, without a phone in his hand. He just appeared. In the first few weekends, it was difficult. There was a strange silence between him and Tamara that wasn't hostility, but was distance. The kind of distance that exists between 2 people who lived through something too intense and don't yet know what form it will take in daily life. He helped his father with the crossword puzzles Anthony had never given up. He read aloud to his mother the medical reports he once ignored and discussed every detail of her asthma treatment with her, with an attention that made Nancy press her lips together to avoid smiling. David left the hospital 22 days after surgery, with a heart that beat as it should, without the wheezing and suffocation he had lived with since he was 2 months old. The first time he went to the Scarsdale mansion, he ran through every room with the curiosity of someone mapping a place that already existed in drawings before existing in reality. He stopped before the garden with the dogwoods and stared at the yellow flowers for a long, silent time. "Is there a good tree for climbing?" he asked. Mr. Carter was the first to respond, with a readiness that surprised everyone, rising from the porch chair and going with the boy to explore the century-old oak at the back of the garden, which indeed had low, firm branches and a trunk with the texture of a natural ladder. Henry watched the scene from outside, his father and a 5-year-old boy evaluating the climbability of an oak tree with all the seriousness in the world. Tamara stood beside Henry, the 2 of them on the porch, shoulder to shoulder at the correct distance of 2 people still learning the language of the space between them. "He's going to try to climb it," she said. "My father will let him. Your father is going to try to climb it with him." They laughed, both of them at the same time, with the same involuntary rhythm of those still discovering they can do that. 3 months later, Henry founded the David Hart Foundation for Children. Not with fanfare, not with a launch event or press coverage, with a document signed on a Tuesday afternoon in the Scarsdale study where, for the first time, he wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple button-down shirt, no tie, and shoes he had bought at a regular store because the Italian leather ones he had set aside after the night of the rain, not out of symbolism, but because he had discovered that feet need comfort more than status. To manage the foundation, Henry chose Tamara Rodriguez, not out of sentimental impulse, out of competence, out of honesty, out of intimacy with the cause, for being the only person he knew who had looked at a $45,000 hospital bill and hadn't thought about negotiating, postponing, or outsourcing. There was only work to be done to pay it. She accepted after 3 days of thinking, not because she needed that much time to decide, but because she wanted to be sure she was deciding for the right reason and not the easy one. The living room of the mansion changed slowly. The dark wood furniture stayed, because Anthony wouldn't give up the hardwood or the mahogany table. But on the mahogany table, where one afternoon $45,000 had been stacked in orderly bundles, there were now other objects: Nancy's teacup, the box of colored pencils David had installed as a permanent resident, Tamara's recipe notebook open to the page for the savory cornbread and stew she made every Friday, and which Anthony had solemnly declared to be the best food he had eaten in 74 years of life. Henry was there on all those Fridays, and on many Wednesdays, and on some Sunday mornings when David woke him at 7 a.m., banging on the guest room door with the urgency of someone who had discovered a beetle in the garden and needed an adult witness immediately. On a Sunday afternoon in a New York winter, 6 months after that Thursday that had changed everything, Henry was sitting on the living room floor with David beside him, the two of them hunched over a huge sheet of drawing paper where the boy was drawing the usual house, large with yellow windows, a tree with good climbing branches, and now a recent addition, a porch with a long table. "What's the porch for?" Henry asked. "For eating together," David said, with the simple and perfect logic of one who hasn't yet learned that important things need justification. Nancy was in her armchair with the knitting she had taken back up in recent weeks, her lungs more stable with the treatment that was now closely monitored. Anthony was sleeping lightly in the other chair with the newspaper folded in his lap. Tamara was in the kitchen making tea, and the scent coming from there was cinnamon and cloves and something deeper that was simply the smell of a home truly inhabited. Henry looked around that room, at the dogwoods appearing through the window, golden in the cold winter light, at David's drawings taped to the wall beside the old photographs, at the inhaler on the arm of his mother's chair, small and necessary, a discreet sentinel, at his father breathing the brief sleep of the satisfied elderly. He had spent his whole life believing that wealth was the sum of what one accumulates, that a man's value could be read in quarterly balance sheets, in acquisitions, in the floors of a building that bore his name. He had built a 32-story tower that touched the New York clouds and recognized himself in it more than in any living person. But the tower was still there, with its contracts and its floors and its tinted glass that didn't let anyone see from the inside out with clarity. And here he was, sitting on the hardwood floor his father had never replaced with porcelain, with a 5-year-old boy who drew houses where everyone fit, receiving for the first time in his life something no bank account had been able to buy: the quiet and ordinary wait of a Sunday afternoon with family. David finished the drawing and held it out to Henry with the solemnity of his signatures. "Uncle Henry, do you live in this house too?" Nancy stopped her knitting. Tamara, who had returned from the kitchen with 2 cups, stood still in the doorway. Henry looked at the drawing, at the large house with the porch with the long table and the tree with good climbing branches and the yellow windows open to a sun that had a face and was smiling. "I do," he said. And David took the pencil back, went to the bottom right corner of the drawing where he always signed, and added, with the letters still shaky but becoming firmer, a new name beside his own: David and Uncle Henry. The end.